This conference will now be recorded.
Alright, so good morning, everyone. So today we have Christian Walter from Nine Elements, and he's going to give a short presentation on their perspective on how code should be branched to the OCP repository for open system firmware, and some, I think it's a brief proposal and some ideas on how to kind of improve or change the process and how to decide whether or not code should be forked or upstream. So Christian, I'll hand over the presentability to you so you can get started.
All right. Hi, thanks, Ryan. Let me just see if I can. All right. I think that works, right?
Yep, I can see it.
Good. All right. So a topic that I'd like to bring up a little bit because I thought about it a lot in the last couple of weeks is like how do we actually treat OSF code within our OCP open system firmware repository, or in general in that group here, right? There are multiple ways what you can do basically, and how you can do it. However, I like to share at least my point of view from a community perspective, because I am personally working very close with a lot of communities involved in firmware, and that is like the scenario that we like to go, and I think that's beneficial for everyone. But yeah, let's see. All right. So yeah, as I said, it's about like how do we handle the code that's in the OCP open system firmware repository, which is basically like a wrapper repository for everything that passes the OCP OSF checklist, and you can put your code and your documentation and build system and whatsoever in there. So everything that is needed, I guess, for building your firmware code. There's some guidance on the top level directory. There's like README file there, and basically it says, so that's an excerpt of these. What is there is that ODMs shall document where the various components are and how to build a complete firmware image. But however, we do not require that the entirety of the source code of the source code is copied into these repos. So what that means is that we are currently allowing the ODMs and IBBs and whoever is there to recite the whole source code in that open system firmware folder or repository. And I think that is actually not a good idea, because
Christian,
yeah.
Can you hear me? No, that's not the case, right? So I don't know if you tuned into the last discussion. We basically had extensive discussion about whether we need to have the source code cloned into the open system firmware folder. Virtually everyone agreed that we shouldn't. So the understanding is not that you have to keep the source code in the open system firmware folder.
Yes. So to be honest, last week I was on holiday, so I haven't tuned in. However, is it still allowed to put it there? Okay, but it is allowed, right?
Well, when we actually go through the checklist submission process, we are going to look at this as extremely closely to make sure that the source code is not being, cloned into the open system firmware, subfolder. And the rationale behind that is that if there is a vibrant community, whether it is a Tiana core boot, or Linux boot, We don't want that source code to be replicated in the open system firmware folder. Rather, we should have a mechanism to pull in the right commit IDs to be able to build the image with the local binaries that are actually in the open system firmware folder, or binary blobs rather. Right? But we're going to basically look at this as very closely when the submission happens to ensure that we're not unnecessarily replicating the source code.
All right. However, that's what we're doing right now. But maybe I proceed and then we come to the point. Okay. Yeah. All right. Okay. So then that's not true basically, but so that should not be the case, which is actually a good approach. The other thing is, so we can either clone like the full source code into that repository, which we basically don't want, which is a good idea. The other thing is that we fork the repository, let's say, into the OCP and have it sitting there, or into your own, I don't know, into your own company GitHub or whatsoever. However, in my personal point of view, forking always leads to fragmentation in that case. So from my experience, I know that when people start to fork like a repository at a certain point in time and then start adding their own patches on top of that, and then like cherry picking patches from the upstream, from the original upstream repository to like get more features and these kind of things, that leads to more fragmentation in the firmware space in terms of that we have multiple solutions who added their own functionality on top, but that did not flow back into the upstream original project. And is most likely then, if it's not maintained anymore, or it's less maintained, or it's self-maintained, that it more acts like a code dump instead of being just a mirror basically on the from the upstream repo and try to engage the community. So basically my proposal is that we do not allow the source code in the open system firmware repository, which we then, as Reddy said, don't do or decided not to do last week. And also that we might not, or that at least we want to discuss about if you do allow having like custom repositories, which are not the upstream repository, pulled into the build system. So what I would like, the proposal that I want to make is, or that at least that you might want to think about, is that we only allow documentation and build systems in the OSF folder. That we, the documentation could be, for example, the checklist, any test reports, like a firmware user guide or BIOS specification or whatsoever. And a build system that does build the firmware system. That build system ideally should pull in like the OSF project on a either a fixed commit or the latest upstream, whatever works. I think fixed commits do work best for stable releases. However, the crucial thing is it should pull it in from the official repositories. If companies like ODMs do need custom patches or functionality, they can be pulled in from a second source, but that should always be not like the main source of where the code comes from. Why should we do that? You might ask yourself, and I think that increases or encourages the ODMs and the IBVs and the people who walked through the open system firmware checklist to work together with the communities, because that is basically what the open source part on these projects is, or the open part itself is, that we should try to engage these communities and do not only leverage the code that is there, and pull in features that we want, but have the main upstream repositories as the main source of truth, so to say, and just have patches sitting that we need on top of that are not upstream yet. But however, we should encourage the ODMs and the IBVs to have these upstreamed and uplined as soon as possible, so that they always can stay as close as possible to the upstream master. That is just something that I thought about and that I wanted to share.
This is excellent, actually. So I'm glad it's consistent with what we all collectively wanted. I guess as we go through the submission process, we have to do the due diligence to make sure the source code is not, cloned.
Yeah, but like, how do we make that? How do we ensure that? Like, if, for example, I or like we as an element, let's say, if we do fork clone Cobot into our own repos, right, and add own functionality on top of that, is that something that is just like, that would not be the ideal case for me. For me, that's not
right.
That's not the way to go. For me, it would be that we still pull in like the Cobot master and having, like, if we need patches, have that sitting on top of that.
Yeah.
And the question is if we want to like have that and somehow be part of the checklist in a later point of view, or do we agree on naturally enforcing that, or like, or do we say that it is fine like it is?
No, I think we need to probably put some disclaimer in the checklist, kind of articulate the same, the guidelines and boundary conditions like what we talked in this meeting and the last meeting.
All right, cool.
Right, Ryan, let's take an action item to update the checklist to reflect that, just to avoid the confusion.
Yep, that makes sense. Kind of more rules. Or perhaps we could even put it into the GitHub repository in the README file exactly what the policy of upstreaming versus forking is.
Yeah, that works too. Yeah, good idea.
Is there ever any case where a fork would make sense? Because I can't think of one.
I cannot think of one.
No, not at all. Fork is dangerous.
Yeah, that's the bottom line, basically.
So let me ask you one very basic question, Rajiv. So I totally understand that we don't want to replicate things, and we can have links into our build system to pull what is needed to build it. But will there be any scenario that we have some very specific source code for our platforms that is not there in other repositories, something that we can use? Will that ever happen, or we will just have the build files to build? Just for my curiosity.
I think we should assume that downstream branches will happen at some point. I mean, I can't think of a single OSF solution that doesn't have a bunch of downstream branches. I mean, even Coreboot, actually, if you look at the Chrome OS devices, every Chrome OS device has its own downstream release branch, and it's pretty much impossible to find a stable Coreboot version that is actually deployed as is upstream on a Chrome OS device. It's all downstream branches with jerry picks. So I don't know. I think that there is going to be a fair amount of that on a per board basis, just based on the reality that we see in the ecosystem.
Exactly, and Nate, and just to be clear, I think per what Christian mentioned that source code should not be there. That's not entirely true. I think what we are saying is we don't have to replicate things, but the source code could be there in the OSF directory as need basis. I think that
Yeah, but just to be careful though, right? The source code by default need to be in the upstream repo with a specific commit ID that you can cherry pick. That's really the basic requirement. Now, beyond that, if there is a specific tool, there is no other place on earth other than just OSF, sure, fine. That's not a problem at all, right? That's by nature, that's not really the default practice, right?
that's true. Yeah.
So cherry picking is acceptable from the upstream, but if there are some hard constraints on why you cannot cherry pick, you have to clone. As an exception, we need to accommodate, but we have to be thoroughly vetting that to make sure there is absolutely no other way to cherry pick to build a specific known good image. Sure, but that's really, we'll cross that bridge when we have a real situation at hand, whether we can brainstorm, right? But as a general guideline, I think we need to avoid that.
Well, I mean,
Okay.
it does make sense to store downstream branches, either, if either in the initial upstream repository, which quite frankly might not always be possible, or in a fork. As long as there's, clear delineation of where the downstream branch forked from, the main branch, it seems uh, it seems like kind of the natural way to do things to me, anyway.
So you're saying it's okay to fork
Well,
downstream?
I
What do you
think
mean by downstream branch?
so. Let's say you have core boot release 4.3 or whatever, right? There's a pretty good chance that, you need 4.3 plus this list of 20 patches on top of that, right? In order to boot platform X, whatever platform X is. So having a pre-baked branch with those 20 patches pre-cherry picked is convenient. But I guess that's kind of what I'm trying to say.
Yeah,
As
so
long as it's
where is the
clear
pre-baked one?
what that list of 20 is, right?
Yeah, so you're basically advocating to have a cloned repo with a pre-baked uh, cloned repo in the downstream. In this case, it is the OSF repo with a specific snapshot that you can actually build off of. I'm saying we should not do that.
So
Yeah, I
I think
agree. I agree, Sean. I need to speak to the Chrome thing a little because I spent a couple of years of my life over there. If you kind of look on average, there's a new Chromebook I think every other week, something like that. I mean, the rate at which Chromebooks appear is just unbelievable, and it has been an issue, keeping the upstream core boot sort of on top of all that because the rate is just crazy. But if we kind of look at the rate at which machines come out, in server space, like, OCP machines, it's really actually pretty leisurely. And I don't think that it's really asking too much that they, at the very least, don't fork. Now, if they want to point at a ref of core boot and then say included in our submission are 10 patches that we apply to that ref because they're not upstream yet, but we will we commit to continuing to get them upstream, that might work. But I just don't see that the kind of rate of delivery of platforms in OCP remotely justifies a fork. It's just my opinion anyway.
And I would also say in the aggregate, right? If you have platform one has N patches, then you have other platforms. It seems kind of unwieldy to me.
I just think that's what the reality of the ecosystem will create. Based on the way I've seen platform delivery work, there's always at least one patch that goes somewhere. And yeah, sure, maybe it goes upstream like a year later or something, but for a lot of them, there's a lot of pre-work necessary before something really becomes acceptable upstream.
Yeah, I just want to make sure, right? I just had this discussion in a different meeting. And we kind of look at the space of UEFI, and we literally have, it's not even a silo, it's like a cube of cubes. Every slightly different board from every different vendor, we got basically a different tree. And that's just, it's not, that's hard to imagine that really continuing. I mean, it's continued for a long time, but it's not something we really want to do. And so we don't want to recreate that here. It's the last thing we want to have happen. So
Yeah,
I totally get
every
you, Nate. Yeah.
every single successful delivery of production platforms has done that, whether it be downstream branches for Chromebooks or whether it be copying trees like we see in the UEFI space, which quite frankly has gotten a lot better over the past 3 years compared to what you'd see for stuff that's a bit older. Still, I mean, there's always going to be a certain amount of cherry picks, I think.
I and and I understand, and I think what we need to do by our nature is we need to have a certain amount of back pressure. So if the back pressure is we don't take a fork, if you tell us that there's this upstream thing and here's the ref and then here's some patches, maybe that's where we say, all right, we accept that, for a certain period of time, that's what we're going to have to do. But the moment you start saying, oh yeah, you can, we'll pull from your fork, I think the game is up. I don't think you ever recover from that. Maybe you do. I mean, it's so, yeah.
Yeah. Like I said, right, we need to look at this as an exception, not as a norm. And exception we essentially have to go through
it
the
is the
reality.
norm for every single platform shipped in the industry ever. Yes, it is.
I want to see the case studies. If you really want to bring in the case study, bring it in and we'll talk about it. I don't want you to assume that.
The case study is just the mere fact of the matter of every single ODM. Like, look at the way the industry is structured, Ready. Everybody, it's very, very decentralized. And with it, the code base gets very decentralized and fragmented as it moves through the supply chain.
So I totally agree with Ron on that we should not allow to do that, because once we allow forks to be accepted just as is, there's no motivation on upstreaming whatever custom patches are on that again. If we just say we take it as is. And we do ship software that work on upstream master on fixed commits, and they move forward like that, and we don't fork the repos out. So
yeah, I mean, I just did the number. There's 324 mainboards in the Coreboot repo today. I actually, at least in my experience, this forking per board is really about as much about the economic model of how BIOSes are delivered as it is about anything else. If you're in a community, which is where we've been, where every single board's got a different image because that's how the money flows, well, that's where we're there. But if you're in a community where the countervailing pressure, the economic pressure is against forking, I think things will change. And proof of concept, U-boot, Coreboot, there's a lot of boards in those repos. People pull from that upstream and it works. So I think that when we talk about how things are
for a select subset of those boards, out of those 300 and some odd boards that you've mentioned, Ron, maybe 20 of them actually work upstream. Most of it is just a dumpster fire. And you know that as much as I.
Hey,
I wouldn't agree. Yeah.
I have a question. So if you look at other communities, as EDK2, Coreboot, UEFI, and just disregard the source code for the repo for a minute and look at the community. Do those communities that are managing that repository, that directory, do you get 20 people that call in on a regular basis to discuss code development and change orders? So
Bill, what is the
I'll take.
I didn't quite get that. I'm sorry.
Well,
Yeah, I also don't get what you mean.
yeah. So here's where I'm going. I respect everybody's opinions about this, but we have an opportunity rather than look back, look forward and say, what's the right solution? And I believe it's a combination of having a good community to share thoughts and debate these, features, and as well as having a common repository that we share. And our intent in having the OSF repository and having code in that repository is that we can put that together with a community. So here we are today with 20 people on the phone, all experienced code developers. And so we have an opportunity looking ahead to say, hey, I'm going to take a repository and I'm going to manage that repository and the features in that as a community. And so, I think that's the goal that we want to have. And ideally, we build products that are based on that single repository. Now, Reddy mentioned earlier with, this goes back to the conversation last week. There's already a repository for EDK2. There's, I assume there's already meetings that go on a regular basis to talk about, code commits and releases that go on. And so I'm simply saying that, hey, we have an opportunity here to establish the OSF repo as the primary repo and use this community where we have 20 people on the phone today and manage that to the best of manage that for the benefit of the industry. Right? And when I say industry, I mean the whole industry.
So Bill, what we're
makes sense.
so the discussion happening right now is more about not making the OCP OSF repository the central one. It's about making the community-based ones like the Coreboot one, the Tiana Core one, the centralized ones. That's actually the primary proposal right now.
Right. I'm okay with that if there's a community built around that where it's actively managed. In cases where you have a project, like EDK2 that's been around for 15 years, 20 years, that makes sense to not do anything with that. There already is a community. There's, lots of forks and branches built off of that. It would be very difficult to do anything differently. But when we have an opportunity to create something new, I think this is, we can look forward and do it differently.
Here's my concern. The way I see OCP is you all set the rules for what marks something is, accepted, and then people submit things that follow the rules, right? If you take a thing and you say, here's this thing, it's at the OCP and it's this open source firmware project, that is, whether you like it or not, an implicit endorsement of that one solution. When what we're really talking about is with OSF, here's the set of requirements you meet. We're not going to tell you which thing to choose, but whatever you choose, it's gotta fit this list. But now all of a sudden, people are going to look and say, well, okay, yeah, they get this set of requirements, but they're also hosting this, apt.io repo. So that sort of says to me, if I really want to get it accepted, I'm gonna start with that. So it unfortunately, the appearance is that your thumb is on the scale, and that is then moving you from kind of being the neutral arbiter of the rules to being the neutral arbiter of the rules, except that there's an implicit choice that maybe is better than other choices, and so that worries me a lot. We're not Linux Foundation. We're the OCP is a different kind of game, and if you're trying to become Linux Foundation, then that really is going to interfere, I think, with the idea that OCP sets rules and is a neutral arbiter and evaluates whether you met the rules or not. So that's my concern. It's almost like saying we're going to be a reseller for company X's platforms, but hey, if you can try and compete too if you meet the rules we set. It doesn't, to me, have a good appearance.
So, Ron, when you say we set the rules, just to clarify, it's everybody on this call. You wrote the rules.
I'm thinking in a broader sense of OCP, being this kind of neutral organization that promulgates the rules, and then people, offer products and the products are evaluated in light of the requirements, and they get accepted or not. But yeah, in terms of OSF, yes, we set those rules.
Right. And so there's two I view kind of two things here. One is, where do you organize the community, and then where do you organize the code? And there's, we all agree that code exists in a lot of different places. Case in point, core boot, EDK2, Linux boot. We're not saying to change that, but at the same time, there's also opportunities to organize the community and organize the community of developers that work on that code. And so in some cases, organizations choose to manage that project outside of the umbrella of OCP, case in point, EDK2, right? And in some cases, they can choose to manage that project community under the umbrella of OCP, and we're happy to host that.
And at that point, I can tell you, because I've had people contact me outside this forum, you don't look neutral anymore.
Well, I mean, that offer extends to everybody. So, I've had a lot of positive feedback.
But why do we start duplicating code and communities?
No, I think we are kind of mixing too many things, right? So let's parse this one at a time. So let's assume for the time being, the starting point of the discussion is that there is a vibrant community, upstream community, that supports essentially everything needed to build a BIOS firmware image. This is the case with the Tiana core. This is the case with core boot, right? In that context, that's really the context that we are talking about. If that is the context where you have the upstream community, if there is a mechanism for us to pull in a specific commit and cherry pick patches to build the known stable image that the checklist went through, we don't need to replicate. That's step number one. The number two, the openness is, no, I not only have that, I need XYZ patches for me to get this done in time for me to get the OCP logo. There is a timing issue. However, I plan to actually submit the patches back in, and then, as an interim, I need to keep these patches here, right? So that's a second, that's mostly a timing issue where upstream merge is happening. There is a lag behind the merge versus the timing of when the OCP certification is happening. The second one, I think, is okay to have that be available as the temporary, the staging area, not as a permanent one. Then the third one is that there is a new open system firmware initiative that is happening. Let's say there is no upstream community, there is no vibrant community, and if OCP wants to take that on and create that vibrant community around that new open system firmware initiative, to me, that's okay. That essentially becomes, very, very similar to the upstream. OCP becomes an upstream for that specific new initiative. If that is really the direction, Bill, you believe is the right thing to do, and the rest of the team believes that, right? But that's really a brand new project, right? where you want to incubate and then actually create a vibrant community. But if you already have a vibrant community out there, which is really the first one that Christian was referring to, we don't need to clone.
So Reddy, maybe I can kind of give you an example of what I'm worried about. So just for sake of argument, let's think about OpenBMC for a second. Now, OpenBMC, we have a PECI driver for it that's more or less mandatory for any out-of-band management design based on an Intel platform, right? Now, that PECI driver has actually been rejected from the upstream OpenBMC community, and it's really a non-trivial amount of added code. So the fact that we're unable to merge the PECI driver upstream basically mandates the need to maintain an OpenBMC fork that includes that PECI driver. Now, there are other cases that I can think of things like this happening outside of OpenBMC where, hey, what I need to ship a product has a lot of stuff on top of what was upstream.
That's a very theoretical discussion. So we need to essentially get to a need for creating a GitHub source code repo because there is a strong rationale that I can't merge or I don't have a landing zone in the upstream. That we can have a discussion.
Yeah,
If there is an upstream already, we don't want to clone, right? So that going back to the step number one.
yeah, but it really depends on how much change there is from upstream and how acceptable to upstream those changes might be. You know, for example, Android. Android has had a fork of the Linux kernel for several years running now. For almost 10 years now.
Yeah, that's essentially a separate community. I don't treat this as really the fork. So,
But it is a fork, and it is synchronized with upstream Linux kernel on a
that's
very
fine.
regular basis.
That's fine, right? That's really
But
a targeted community to focus on a targeted device grouping.
and
I
I
still
think
don't see
that
the reason for
And who,
this.
who hosts that for?
I think that can very much happen here, and in fact, I think it is likely to happen in certain circumstances, like the PECI driver for OpenBMC, for example.
Isn't the example you're giving, Nate, just the kind of the terminal of something that hasn't upstreamed yet, but hopefully will? And in that
Well,
case, the
so
hopefully will is maybe infinite, right? So it just never upstreams.
well, the thing is, it was upstreamed at one point, and then it was removed from upstream because they decided they didn't like it anymore.
Okay, so
So,
Nate, you're
I mean,
making a point. There is a specific set of, there are specific set of items that there is no placeholder for upstream, which you are kind of mixing with a specific set of items that has a strong placeholder for the upstream. If you can make a case for, yeah, I don't have a landing area for the upstream, let's say for the PECI driver, I want PECI driver to be a permanent placeholder in the OSF GitHub, that's a different discussion. Let's not mix that with essentially an upstream where you have all the work going on.
so just to be completely clear with everybody, I prefer one upstream as much as everybody else, but I don't think we can write rules that legally mandate one way or the other based upon many complex scenarios that arise as in the open source community that just for whatever reason we never really can 100% agree between different individuals, right? And things like that happen, and then you get things like a forked OpenBMC where the fork gets the PECI driver, right? And I mean, we all see that in the open source community happen on occasion. So we should understand that that might be something that needs to be accommodated in certain circumstances.
So
I
Nate,
Yeah,
just had,
but
my belief is
but
that scenario that you just mentioned is very typical. That there's key features that go into a platform when it goes to production that aren't upstream, and that they had to be, the code exists somewhere, and unfortunately, it usually exists in a private repo owned by or maintained by the ODM. And
Not
so,
really, Bill. No, no, no. I contest that.
okay,
So let's take this in. And my visibility is really in the core boot space, and and I could be really off base within the context of Tiana core, right? So let's say for the time being, we are actually doing the uh, Delta Lake submission process,
uh-huh.
right? Um, Now we submit 4 different patches, and they are actually going through the review process, right? You can always, those patches are actually not on my desktop, not on my repo. They are actually in the core boot review repo. Those patches are actually actively going through the review repo in the core boot, maintained by the core boot through the CI infrastructure. Everything is actually done through that because somebody has to provide the feedback too when I submit a patch. I can't have it in my repo, cloned repo. It just doesn't work that way, scale that way. So the community, that upstream community, provides that facility for patches to be submitted to be reviewed. But we may be pulling the patches that are not completely upstreamed into master, which is okay. You can always pull it from the core boot review patches. That's what we do for living, even now. So if they are not actually maintained by specific company repo that is actually trying to submit the patches. But let's assume for the time being they are being maintained by a specific company repo, and and if it happens to be that we have too many of those things, and there is a need for consolidation, totally makes sense. I'm not saying that's not the right thing to do. I have not seen a specific situation where we have that situation at hand as a norm, as opposed to as an exception.
I mean, in my opinion, I mean that is what the OCP can bring to the table, right? We are, as you already said, like a lot of people from different domains and also from different communities. And if these things happen that Nate brought up, that there are things that cannot be merged or seem unable to merge, and even though I think it could have been an issue that Intel could have resolved with the OpenBMC community. I don't know the story behind it, but I think with enough enthusiasm in that thing, you could have resolved that. And I mean, and that is what this community here, that open system firmware community here, can bring to the table. That we say, okay, we are people who are involved in the community, and we can show you the way how you can actually upstream all your patches that is there. Because in the end, that community thing, the communities, that's a thing of working everyone together. But if you allow straight from top that you say forking your own thing is okay and maintaining it on your own is okay, you are like taking out any motivation on ever bringing things upstream. That's just reality, and that's just a bad thing to do.
That's really right. I agree.
Yeah, I mean,
but
yeah,
there's certain circumstances like the Picky driver where upstream did not want it. Period.
yeah.
And there
I
was
think you're hung up on. Yeah, see, that's an exception process. It's not norm. And
Yeah.
like I said, for the exception, we can actually have that discussion. We are not shutting the door. You're assuming we are completely shutting the door. That's not the case.
well, if we use words like shall, then we are shutting the door. That's where I have the concern.
These are all guidelines, right? These are not like a legal document that you have to bind by. There is always an exception process. So I
No,
wouldn't
no,
worry about.
well,
I
so
wouldn't.
the PowerPoint said shall. It should say should. I guess that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, if that's
I mean, but
really the
that's
wording
also
difference that's
something.
causing the gripe. Yeah,
I mean, that's also something, Nate, that can be resolved, right? And if there is an issue, then then if you're an ODM, right, you should try to upstream the patches. And you can then still hand in your submission to the OCP OSF checklist and say, okay, we got these patches upstream, which are not merged yet, and we are running on that commit, like on that fixed commit. And however, we do have the problem with the community that we cannot integrate that, and then we can find a solution for that. However, allowing straight up front that is a way you can go, just forking it because you don't actually start the process of engaging the community, that's not the right thing to do.
Oh, I absolutely agree with that. So I think we should more choose verbiage like efforts should be made to upstream changes.
Yes, I agree with that. And also, it's if you're still having to maintain the upstream. So even if you have a fork, you're still trying to follow whatever's going on in upstream at the same time. And so in the end, the advantage is to have it all up in one place and have the community as a whole. Now you're splitting it and then having to manage multiple places. Ultimately unsustainable.
Yeah. 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 Um,
Okay, so
yeah.
my reading, just reading what people have been saying, I think we're all like on board that fork is absolutely something we really want to avoid at all costs. We accept that there are cases where, with a proper exception process, we can take it on a basis where we're hoping that over a period of a year or so, at worst, they clean it up and get it upstream. We can help them do that. There may be some cases that are just absolutely impossible, like Nate's example. And again, I do express my concern that, we begin life with a fork of OpenBMC as an OCP GitHub repo. I'm still very worried about that. And again, it's not just the OSF thing. I've heard about this from OpenBMC people. So I just want to get that out there. But I kind of have a feeling like we're largely in agreement that we all dislike forks. We've all seen cases where there was no choice, and we all want to have real strong back pressure exerted on forks that happen.
I agree with that.
Yeah. Exactly.
But I don't think we should say that it's never going to happen at the same time, I guess, is the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, you're right.
I mean, for example, there's LibreBoot, which is really a fork of coreboot, but he doesn't say so, or sorry, she doesn't say so. I won't bring up that garbage can.
Yeah, LibreBoot was politics gone insane in the open source community, and that's as much as I probably should say.
Yeah, but anyway, even coreboot forks do happen, and sometimes not for technical reasons.
No argument.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess as a standard practice, we don't, encourage clones. As an exception, on a case-by-case basis, if there is a genuine reason, we can accommodate with the intention of helping them to actually go back to the mainstream upstream branch at some point. And then if there is a systemic pattern that we keep seeing these exceptions, and if that pattern happens to be that there is a lack of support in the upstream for certain types of, lack of better word, maybe features or a track grouping of features, then we can look at and revisit if there is a need for us to actually, host that specific grouping in the OSF repo.
Yeah. And by the way, one thing that does occur, a thought that does occur, this is an incredibly valuable role that OCP could play, which is having a short list or experience or documents or whatever it takes. But OCP is sort of the entity that can help companies that may not be used to doing this kind of upstreaming, to get that accomplished.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's probably one area where we can collectively help to make sure that we don't diverge, but rather we use our combined expertise to make sure that these things go back to the mainstream.
Also, I think it would be helpful to have like a committee or a group that's willing to intercede with maintainers of like OpenBMC and just have conversations, like trying to understand what it is. And sometimes something is lost in translation, you know. So
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is some really great discussion, but so I have to interrupt. So in the last 10 minutes, Akna brought up this recommendation from the security group. Is Akna on the call today? Oh yes.
I am. I am.
Yeah, so I think we
And
should, in the last 10 minutes, we should review this recommendation. They have a replacement they suggested to the checklist, specifically on how the firmware should be signed. I'll share it real quick. I think it was Yeagle. Was that right? Aknar Yeagle shared this with us?
yeah, it was Yigal. And it kind of came out of a comment that was placed in the checklist just around there was a comment that said that it was mandatory. And so I guess it raised some flags, at least for, those that will be reading it. And this was row 44 on the checklist, which talked about ownership. And so we were trying to understand what it meant by saying that the security group plans to require firmware signing. And, if there is firmware that, the signing key and it needs to be changed, who's going to hold that key? Are we holding that key? Who's holding that key?
I see. It should be the owner of the system. But is this the replacement that they suggest? Is that right?
Yeah, he
Is this the
came up with a possible suggestion, but
Who was that?
this was Yigal from the security group. So right now it says if a firmware needs to be signed, they can either choose their own firmware signing key and change it as needed over time, or obtain the necessary signing keys through a transfer of ownership. And then there was a note there that said, in particular, a requirement to choose immutable keys in advance and provide to, a chipset vendor or an ODM makes the system non-compliant, right? That's what's currently in there. And I think his recommendation was that the note should be that, hey, due to security reasons, some customers may configure a system to be locked to only accept signed firmware from a specific vendor or an owner at the hardware level, at the potential expense of limiting the ability to do the ownership transfer. So I guess I'm asking this group, and specifically those that are looking for this key, is this comment better than the comment that you have under B1 BI.1?
EI.
It in your, it says replace this. And so
This is a bit of a word salad. I mean, maybe some comment is good, but and that spec will be released at a later date. Somehow wording like that never vanishes.
That's true, but I mean, right now, I don't think that they have the spec. So my question to you is, if they don't have the spec, then right now it's not relevant, right? When and if they have the spec and we're ready to add it to the checklist, great. But why even stir the pot with the potential for something that doesn't exist today? So that's number one. And number two is, if the firmware needs to be signed, then what happens when they, some customers want to configure a key to be locked. And so
today, part of the driver here, stop me if I'm saying this wrong, anyone, but part of the driver here is like, and this has happened at Google, we got a machine and the key is owned by a vendor and they're not going to give us that key, and we're unable to do anything with the firmware, period. And so that's kind of what we're calling out here, because we've hit this problem over and over again, as have others. So and the problem is, these keys tend to, like, you get a lot of machines for Google and it's going to have the same key as a lot of machines that were sold to many other different companies. So that vendor is not going to give us the key, and they're not even set up to be able to change the key today, on like a per lot basis, and they're not set up to transfer the key to the new owner. I mean, so I'm not quite sure. Is that the concern of the security group, or what's the deal?
No,
Well,
I
no,
think
it was.
what they're saying is I think the friction point is this has gone through so many discussions, unbelievable. So within the context of OSF, what we are saying is, if there is a need for a firmware to be signed, you follow the B.dot, right, sub-steps.
Yeah.
What security group is saying is, no, it has to be signed. My point is, no, that's not mandatory requirement.
Right.
Unless he is going to, unless they're going to, restrict all the platforms, none of the platforms can go through if that's a requirement. Unless you have a platform root of trust as an unbiased entity on the platform that can actually give you that flexibility, it's not going to happen. How many platforms does it have? Do you have in the market today with the platform root of trust that is well established? So they can't be thinking about a very artificial scenario and lock down pretty much all the OCP, approvals. So what we told them is, don't make it mandatory.
Sorry, I was a little slow here. Okay.
So if you don't make
They're
it
saying
mandatory,
it is required.
Exactly. So it's just a conflict, right, between what they're asking and what you're asking. And I just want to make sure that if a supplier goes through this, the OSF tab is only required if they're going for OCP accepted. So I guess maybe it is mandatory for OCP accepted, but for security, if it's a requirement, then that's an issue, right?
Yep, exactly.
Under what circumstances is it a requirement to be shared openly? Do they just want to know if the transfer of ownership is available? And if it is, great, you do it under NDA or under whatever with another company, with the supplier or the next owner, or how does that work?
I think the transfer of ownership is a critical feature if we have a system where the firmware can be signed. Even if I do work for a company which doesn't support that yet, I know the pain that it does represent. So that's I really think it's critical, especially for circular economy and long-term maintenance.
So my question is, right now, if you look in the supplier's checklist, it just says, note the security group plans to require firmware. I say we just delete that note and move forward. And then when it is required, some date out in time, then you guys can solve it amongst yourselves.
But can you just repeat what the security group is willing to enforce? Because I'm not sure to have properly understood the technical aspect.
Okay, so I'm wondering if I can share my screen. Give me, Ryan, since you have the screen, can you go to the security requirements, the supplier requirements document right now?
Yes, hold on. I'll just, switch over to that tab. Is this the one you're speaking of?
Yep. So right now, see, there's a note there that says that the security group plans to, nope, go back to your OSF tab.
Down.
Yeah.
Right there.
Yep. there's a note right there that says that the security group, plans to require this signing. I say we just delete that note.
Yeah, we don't.
Honestly,
Yeah, exactly.
just delete the note, and when and if it becomes a requirement, then we deal with it at a future update to the spreadsheet. And I think I'm good with that. It's just sending a conflicting.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
just sending a conflicting, message to suppliers that says, okay, well, if it's need to be signed, then it's great, but it's going to be required. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, this is really a timing issue. So one side we are saying this is a draft, and the other side it basically says the note says, "Oh, I'm going to enforce it." It's just contradictory to me.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm saying is that can we delete the note in that refers to the security group? Just I'm happy to delete it and it goes away, and then we keep column C as is, right? That doesn't change.
I got it. I was lost. I see what you're saying now. Sorry.
Yeah, me too. I think we can remove the note, so that's okay.
Okay, perfect. All right, done.
One last thing. The OCP summit. I think the call for papers is open for OSF.
Yes, the call for papers is open. The summit is going to be a hybrid summit, meaning that we are planning on having a in-person element. And those that can travel to San Jose on November 9th and 10th are welcome to attend in person. The call for papers is open right now and will be open until July 23rd. And we, just given the space issues and the COVID issues and all of that, we may be restricted in terms of the number of tracks we can have. So I'm really encouraging every group to submit their papers. And we will decide based on the papers what tracks we can hold. I mean, if we get a lot of papers coming in for OSF, then we'll hold that track in person, right?
Yeah. Right, that sounds good. Let's talk more about the summit at the next call.
Perfect. Happy to do that.
Thanks so much, Akna.
Great. Hey, thank you for making my life easier here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, sorry I didn't quite get it there. But yeah.
No worries. No worries.
All right.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye.
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 Bye bye.